Although that morality cannot be legislated, behavior can be regulated. Even though it may be true that the law cannot change the heart, it can restrain the heartless. Even though it may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, it can restrain him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important also. And so while the law may not change the hearts of men, it can and it does change the habits of men. And when you begin to change the habits of men, pretty soon the attitudes will be changed. Pretty soon the hearts will be changed.
Martin Luther King Jr. speaking about his hope for America's future almost 1 year before his assassination. Let's bring in right now two-time Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Tom Ricks. And today we're wrapping up our week-long discussion of his great new book, Waging a Good War, A Military History of the Civil Rights Movement, 1954 to 1968. Also with us, the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, Dr. Peniel Joseph. He is also a professor of history at the University of Texas, author of the new book, The Third Reconstruction, America's Struggle for Racial Justice in the 21st Century. And I understand he's a young man. He just, somebody said he just turned 50. If so, congratulations. It just gets easier after 50, baby. Just tell yourself that. Tell yourself that. Anyway, thanks so much for being here. You know, Tom, what I think what's so fascinating about your book is there's this beautiful juxtaposition of the civil rights movement. The use of military training with the philosophy of Jesus, nonviolence, turning the other cheek, praying for those who persecute you, hardly ever noticing when something is when you are wronged, or at least trying to get that into your mind so you can actually move forward and not engage in violence. Talk about that.
Confrontational nonviolence is, I think, a key to the civil rights movement and its successes. One of the three lessons I would say we take away from the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s is that nonviolence works, it has moral authority, and in political terms, it brings along the American people. The middle group that you want to have their support, you don't want to turn them off, they are turned off by violence. Related to that, training and strategy are essential. Training helps prevent violence if people have discipline and understand how to operate. I think the third great lesson is that a lot of the problems from the 1960s are still with us. Stacey Abrams down in Georgia is focusing on attacks on voting rights. Black Lives Matter and others have been focusing properly on police brutality and the number of killings by police in this country. But I've got to say, I want to defer her to Professor Joseph, who has written a terrific book precisely about where we are now in this third reconstruction, as he calls it.
Eddie?
Peniel, I wanted to, first of all, congratulations on your next book, this new book, The Third Reconstruction. I've been reading you for a long time. So give us a sense of the parameters of this reconstruction as you've described. What are its elements? What are the contradictions? What are the challenges that face the call for what we might think of as a third founding?
Well, yeah, thank you, Eddie. When we think about the third reconstruction, the four pivot points are the election of Barack Obama in 2008, the founding of Black Lives Matter 1.0 in 2013, the rise of MAGA and Donald Trump in 2016, and then really all the juxtapositions we saw since 2020, the rise of BLM, the racial disparities of the pandemic, the most racially divisive presidential election in American history. And then finally, you know, I look at the 3 Wednesdays in January where we see the riot at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, the second impeachment of Trump on January 13th, and then the inauguration of Biden and the first Black woman VP on January 20th, 2021. And what we're seeing here, Eddie, are two different stories. One is a story of reconstructionist story of supporters of multiracial democracy confronting a redemptionist narrative of supporters of white supremacy. So when we think about the whole CRT hoax and the attack on truth teaching in the United States, voter suppression, this is all about the third Reconstruction. Tom's book is really a brilliant accounting of the second Reconstruction through a military lens. And of course, the first Reconstruction, which you've talked about, other people have written about very brilliantly, is those 3 decades after the Civil War, where we're trying to confront the emancipationist legacy of the Civil War, right? And I think the lessons we learn are that stories count. The narratives we tell ourselves about who we are as Americans are the most important stories we can tell. And so this third Reconstruction, we're locked in a pitched battle between those who are supporters of, say, stories like the 1619 Project, or stories like what James Baldwin tells us, and you've told the Baldwin story brilliantly in Begin Again, versus that redemptionist story, that lost cause narrative. And remember, the lost cause, it's actually bigger than white supremacy. White supremacy is one of the tenets of the lost cause, but it really thinks about things like tradition, a smaller government, authoritarianism, reimagined as heroism. So when we think about the parameters, we see racial progress during this third Reconstruction, because there always is progress, but we also see this backlash during the third Reconstruction. And what we have to do is tell a more compelling story about multiracial democracy that can lead to a kind of really a civic nationalism that understands that the struggle for Black citizenship and dignity is the beating heart of American democracy.
And Tom, in your book, you talk about really recognizing the sacrifice of every member of the movement. And you write in part this: no, the civil rights movement was not a traditional army with weapons and a single command structure. Yet, from 1955 to 1968, a disciplined mass of people waged a concerted, organized struggle in dedication to a cause greater than themselves. Many died, many more shed blood, thousands were put behind bars. In conducting their campaigns, activists made life-changing decisions with inadequate information while operating under wrenching stress and often facing violent attacks. The sacrifices of movement leaders and rank-and-file members led to a realized, if imperfect, democracy. If we are to hold on to their gains and reinforce them, we must recognize the nature of their effort so that we can properly prepare ourselves to safeguard and sustain our democracy. Mike Barnicle.
Tom, the metaphor that strings throughout your incredible book here, it strikes me that we're talking about, in logistics and communications, we're talking about prehistoric times, the mid-1950s and 1960s. And yet the discipline shown by this marching army, this crusade that was partially victorious. It's not completely victorious yet, as we just spoke to. But what are your thoughts about that? Given the passage of time, it's amazing what happened, what progress was made in the face of the obstacles that it confronted.
The obstacles were enormous, and that's actually one reason I'm optimistic about today, is the civil rights movement looked like it had no power. All the power resided with the dominant caste, the white power structure in the South. They had all the political offices, they had the banks, they had the police forces, they had the jobs. Yet, the civil rights movement had the moral authority. And I think this is a real insight of Professor Joseph's, which is if you have a narrative that people understand and you have dignity and your discipline in how you operate, you can gain the upper hand. And that is incredibly important in the eyes of America to maintain that moral authority. So I fundamentally come away with this with some optimism, and I was pleased to see at the end of Professor Joseph's book that he's kind of optimistic too, despite all the difficulties we're facing.
Tom, eventually it came to changing hearts and minds. Hearts and minds had to be changed. There was so much public opposition to what the civil rights movement was doing at the time, and a lot of those minds really didn't change until some of the victories were won. Explain that dynamic and how that might work or have lessons for our times.
I think two things were going on, especially in 1963, when the civil rights movement really moves onto the national stage. The first thing is a lot of people supported segregation as long as there was no cost to them. But once businessmen and corporations said, wait a second, this is hurting us, they started reconsidering the cost. And you get a real split in the South between the business community and the white supremacist power structure. The second thing is two competing visions of America were presented, just as Professor Joseph says there are these days. In 1963, you got Bull Connor's America, police dogs and fire hoses being used against children, versus Martin Luther King's America presented in the I Have a Dream speech. And Americans looked at the two and said, you know, we're going to go with Martin Luther King on this one.
And in closing, Dr. Peniel Joseph, I just want to touch on the optimism that Tom was talking about. Do you feel optimism?
Yeah, you know, Mika, I do. And here's why. I think what Tom describes is the 1955 to 68 period that brings about a racial justice consensus in the United States that lasts for half a century, between June 11th, 1963 and June 25th, 2013. That's the start of John F. Kennedy's racial justice speech on June 11th, all the way to the Supreme Court Shelby v. Holder decision 2013, which really ends voting rights as we know it. But that 50-year consensus is what brings us Michelle and Barack Obama. It brings us Oprah Winfrey, but it also brings you Hillary Clinton. It brings you the most women and people of color and Black citizenship and dignity and access in American history. We are living in a post-consensus moment, which is why we feel in part so much political divisions, at times disappointment. We're living in a context of attacks against American democracy. But we're also living in an age where multiracial democracy is on the rise. We saw this in 2020. We saw so many people say not only Black Lives Matter, but people who are trans and AAPI and indigenous and poor white people locking arm in arm, 25 million, the most in American history. So we see that there's a different narrative of the United States that can bring us together.